Welcome back, everybody. I'm here to talk to you today about Lord Byron, the greatest romantic poet of them all. He had a lot of different names he went by over the course of his life. George Gordon Byron, George Gordon, George Noel, Noel Byron, Lord Byron, and then, of course, his favorite, Le Diable Boiteux, and there were probably many more. The famous tagline that also followed him, that was created by one of his lovers, was that he was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And as much as he claimed to loathe this reputation, he also exploited it for his fame and for his own profit, which we'll talk about over the course of this introduction to Byron and his life and his work. So, the first thing you have to know about Byron is that he's not like the other boys. Oh no. He was very, very handsome, which you can tell that you've seen a lot more pictures of Byron just on this page than you've seen of any of the other romantic poets that we've discussed. We don't have nearly so many images of Keats or Shelley or Southey or Coleridge or Wordsworth. They weren't particularly handsome men, but Byron, being so handsome, was often painted and drawn, possibly because of his own vanity, but possibly because a lot of people wanted to draw pictures of him. Um, he was famous for being a handsome, handsome man, particularly with the cleft chin and the pouty lips. He was popular with everyone, which he also exploited to his advantage. And he also was a man of privilege. He had a significant pedigree. He was born George Noel Gordon in London in 1788. His father was Captain John Mad Jack Byron, who had the title to pass down to his son. But his mother, Catherine Gordon, was the heiress with the money. And this is Catherine here, and this is the only image that we have of Mad Jack here. Now, you can go ahead and draw your own conclusions about what kind of man Captain John Byron was, who went by Mad Jack. His first wife died, and the circumstances of that are somewhat suspicious. It's quite possible that he murdered his first wife. And he had a title, but he was penniless, and he needed to marry someone with money, and that happened to be Catherine Gordon, whom he met in Bath, and who was discouraged by all of her friends and family um, to marry Mad Jack, but she did anyway, possibly because he was as handsome as his son, although this etching doesn't really present him as a very handsome man. But he took the surname Gordon in order to inherit Catherine's money. As much as we often think about women taking men's name in Western society, in a patriarchal Western society, when they marry, in the British peerage, the money often went with the name. And it didn't matter if it was a woman or a man. If you wanted the money that came with the name, you had to take the name. So, Mad Jack Byron became Mad Jack Gordon when he married Catherine in order to get her money. And get her money he did. He got her money and he absconded with it, pretty much. As soon as she was pregnant, he was gone. And so Byron was raised in Scotland at his mother's family estate, at their castle in Scotland. He was christened George Gordon Byron, but then by the time he got to school, his father was already gone, and his mother switched it around, so he was George Byron Gordon with her last name at the end. It's all very confusing, and frankly, Byron himself flipped it around whenever it was convenient for him. Because when he was 10, his great uncle died, and that was William Byron, the fifth Baron Byron, who was also known as the Wicked Lord and Devil Byron. Now, if you're keeping up, his father was known as Mad Jack, and his great uncle was known as the Wicked Lord and Devil Byron. So perhaps you're catching a thread of the types of personalities that ran in this Byron family. And when he died, George became the sixth Baron Byron. I'm not sure why they skipped his father in the lineage. Perhaps his father was unlocatable at that point in time, or perhaps his father just wasn't in the line for some reason. Not sure. But anyway, when his great uncle died, little Georgie became Lord Byron, the sixth Baron Byron. And remember, Shelley was in line to become a baron as well. These were not minor titles. A baron was a big deal. He was up there. But then later in life, he added that original Noel back on in order to inherit his ex-mother-in-law's estate. He was legally entitled to that money because he'd been married to his wife, and even though it should have been his wife's money, it became his if he changed his last name to Noel, and he did, to get the money. He's a great dude. Anyway, the law allowed him to do it, so he did. Now, when he was a young poet, the first thing he published was a collection of poems called Hours of Idleness in 1807, which was savage in the Edinburgh Review. In other words, it got a really bad review. And then in 1809, Byron had what you would call a clapback. He wrote something called English Bards and Scotch Reviewers, which was lambasting critics, basically, kind of like a satire, and essentially suggested that all the critics were jealous. And some were so mad that they actually challenged Byron to a duel over it because they were not accustomed to being satirized or to having, clapbacks. And Byron's first, it was the Byron's first in a long line of satirical works that target enemies or people who make fun of him. We will see that in at least one of the pieces that we read of his later this week. In 1809, he toured Portugal, Spain, Greece, and Turkey. And that really gave him the travel bug, and it inspired his first big hit poem, which is called Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Why does Childe have an E on the end? Because he's a romantic poet, and they like to be extra, and so he was. But Childe Harold basically was Byron. He just named him Harold instead of himself, and put his own ideas and persona into a character with a different name, more or less. And so this story, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which is somewhat narrative, kind of like Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but much, much longer and far more ruminative on the feelings of the narrator. And that is Harold, who, like Byron, has traveled far abroad and who feels disillusioned by the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and is very depressive and melancholy. And that title character, Harold, would come to be recognized as the first Byronic hero. Now note that is in bold. It is in a different color and it is underlined to indicate that is something important. We will see this figure again and again. The Byronic hero is a major romantic archetype that we have, for whom we have Byron to thank. For which we have Byron to thank. And I'll talk to you in more detail later in this lecture about what that is exactly. But Childe Harold's Pilgrimage is the first time we see this archetype, and I'll define it for you in a moment. And this would be the cover of the first section, the first canto of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage that was published in London in 1825. All right. So, sorry, this is the cover of what was published in 1825. All right. One thing that you have to know about Byron is that everything in his life is tied up in his sexuality and his expression of his sexuality. And he had many, many lovers of both genders. The female lovers he had are more public and are talked about more. And the male lovers are much more secretive. We don't know as many of their names and identities. He undoubtedly detailed them in his memoir, but his friends burned his memoir after his death, which is an extraordinary literary crime, P.S., by the way. But ultimately, he left England in part because his open bisexuality was so unacceptable. Just like with Shelley and Shelley's ability to express his atheism, his title and his privilege let him be much more upfront about his atheism and endure whatever punishments people could throw at him because of his privilege. And Byron's privilege allowed him to believe that he could just do whatever he wanted. And in a way, that was good because he was bisexual and he wasn't about hiding it. He wasn't interested in living a fake life or being in the closet. But it was completely unacceptable in British society. Had he not had a title, had he been anyone else, he would undoubtedly have been imprisoned for practicing any sort of homosexual activity. And there are other literary figures who were, like Oscar Wilde, for example. But Byron never went to prison because Byron was a baron. He was a lord. But he ultimately had to leave England because of the opprobrium. And he felt so censored, and there were so many threats of what could happen to him if he continued to live however he wanted. So he's like, you know what? England sucks anyway. I hate England. And he did. He really, 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 really hated England. He hated England so much, as a matter of fact, that in his will, when he died, he left the majority of his estate to his daughter Ada, but said that if she married an Englishman, she would not get any of it. So that's how much he hated England, and he wanted to remove his line from England even. And he wrote the lines, "Ah, sure some stronger impulse vibrates here, which whispers friendship will be doubly dear to one who thus for kindred hearts must roam and seek abroad the love denied at home," which a lot of critics have pointed to as his way of saying that he has to go abroad so that he can express the love that he feels for men as well as women. But because I don't know as much about his male partners, I won't be talking about them in as much detail as his female partners. The female partners were reported on in the news. It was part of the scandalous package that made Byron such a sensation and part of that early tabloid fodder. The first one was this Lady Caroline Lamb on the right. She was drawn into that Byronic Hero archetype that I was talking about. He was a star for being a poet. He was emotional. He was famous. He was rich. He was good looking. And he also had a club foot. Oh, that's also a key to Byron's attraction, which you wouldn't think so. You would think that would be an imperfection, but we'll get to why it wasn't later. A club foot, by the way, is just a genetic deformity. Has something to do with one of his feet. We're not exactly sure what was wrong with his foot because he was very sensitive about it and wouldn't talk about it, and we didn't see it, and he, didn't detail it with anyone. But something was wrong with the foot, and that little defect made him all the more attractive to women somehow. And Lady Caroline Lamb was drawn to him like catnip. She could not get enough, and she was not even interested in trying to be discreet about it, about her affair with Byron, despite the fact that she was married to a man who was very high up politically, who ultimately became prime minister and special advisor to Queen Victoria later on. She didn't care. She carried on with Byron flagrantly, let everyone know, and kind of lost her mind behind him. And then when he dumped her, he moved on to Lady Oxford, who was Jane Elizabeth, who was also married. And then meanwhile, Lady Caroline Lamb was stalking him. And he was extraordinarily cruel about it. Lady Caroline Lamb stopped eating when she dumped him. And he told his friends cruelly that he was being haunted by a skeleton. At one point, she dressed up like a young boy so that she could sneak past the security to get into his house. And she went into his office and she wrote across the blotter on his desk, "Remember me," in big font. And, she had to be escorted out, and it was a whole big scandalous ordeal. But she was the one who claimed that Byron was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. There is no doubt that she was a little bit unhinged, but also that he was not a cool boyfriend, not even a cool side boyfriend when you're married. There's no question that he treated her very badly, as he probably also did with Lady Oxford, although she handled it better when he dumped her. And then a lot of the big whispers was about his sister, Augusta Lee, who is pictured here. and she was his half sister. She was the product of Mad Jack, his father's first marriage. So she was his older sister, and it was alleged that the two of them had a sexual affair, even though they were half siblings, which of course is incredibly scandalous. And Byron said publicly that, he denied it completely, and to even suggest such a thing about a man should be against the law, that of course this had not happened, that this was repulsive. But then in 1814, she had a child, a girl. And this child that she had was definitely not her husband's, because her husband was also a sea captain and he had been gone for a long period of time when she got pregnant. So definitely not her husband's. And Byron went to visit the child and then made a comment in a letter to a friend, I think to Shelley, but I'm not 100% sure, but made a comment in a letter that the child wasn't an ape and expressed some sort of relief about that. I don't know if that was relief that, oh, no one will say it's mine because the child doesn't look deformed from incest, or, oh, thank goodness, even though this kid is mine, it doesn't look like it's the product of incest. And of course, I think as we've talked about in other contexts in class before, it takes several generations of inbreeding before you see physical symptoms of incest. So it wouldn't have anyway. But anyway, who knows if this was Byron's child or not, but there was plenty of speculation that he had had an affair with Augusta Lee and they'd had a child together. So you couldn't make this stuff up. The scandal that followed him everywhere just built up, and people loved it, just like we love celebrity scandal today. Okay, and then in probably the dumbest move of his whole life, he decided to get married. Why? I do not know. He married this woman named Anne Isabella, who went by Annabella Milbank in 1815. She happened to be the cousin of Lady Caroline Lamb, although I'm not sure that was the reason why he married Annabella Milbank. But Annabella Milbank was completely unlike any woman that you would think Byron would want. Not because she wasn't attractive, she was, but she was brilliant, utterly brilliant at math. She was a mathematician, but of course, as a woman, she couldn't really do anything with it but, devise some algorithms in the privacy of her bedroom, more or less. And she was also incredibly moral and ethical and a devout Christian. I guess Byron completely had her snowed when he married her. I guess he convinced her that she had converted him and that all of his evil ways were in the past and that he wasn't going to continue doing whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, with whomever he wanted. And they had a daughter together, Ada Lovelace, who might be someone you've heard of before. Ada Lovelace worked with Charles Babbage. She was the first computer programmer, and Charles Babbage was in the Royal Society. That thing we talked about with Samuel Pepys back in the Restoration period. And Ada Lovelace was a mathematician and computer programmer on her own and was brilliant just like her mother and her father. But she had very little exposure to her father over the course of their lives. Annabella refused to let Ada have any contact with her father. As a matter of fact, refused to let Ada have any contact with poets in general. And they separated and ultimately divorced for obvious reasons. Infidelity on Byron's part, alleged incest. Annabella definitely believed that Byron had fathered this child with his sister Augusta. And then, of course, the sodomy rumors, the rumors about him having male lovers, was something that Annabella could not tolerate for even a moment. And then on top of that, the growing interest from the press and the stalking and the paparazzi aspect of his life, she just could not endure. And she coined the term Byron mania to describe Byron's celebrity, which, as recently as like Beatlemania or Bieber fever, this type of concept began with Byron and his relationship with the press. And so in 1816, once she filed for divorce, he left England for good. And by all accounts, he was devastated that Annabella insisted on divorcing him. He really wanted her to stay as his wife, but for obvious reasons, she could and would not. And divorce was pretty much unheard of. And that was it. He was out and never came back to England after 1816. So, at that point, he wandered around in Europe, hanging out with Percy Shelley and his wife, Mary Shelley. You remember them and their little trip with Clairmont to Switzerland. That's where they met. And then once they all met up in Venice, he got Clairmont pregnant. And he was not a fan of Clairmont. He didn't like her at all, but she apparently was very forward and supposedly seduced him, and he just could not resist. And voila, they had a child together named Allegra. But he refused to let Claire raise Allegra. He felt that Claire was not emotionally or mentally stable, and he did not think that Percy or Mary should raise Allegra because they were atheists, and also they were vegetarian. And they did not have a good track record because, as you'll recall, 3 out of their 4 children died. And so Byron did not feel that they were capable of raising a child. So he took Allegra from Claire. And this is after Percy insisted that Byron, admit the paternity of the child and support the child financially. And so he only agreed to do so if he could have say over the child. And he took Allegra to be raised in a convent by nuns in Italy. And unfortunately, she contracted, I can't remember which disease, but like one of those diseases, cholera, yellow fever, I don't know, something that was sweeping Italy at the time. And she died around the age of 6 in a convent, which Clairmont was incredibly bitter about, as you would imagine. And they did not have what you'd call a relationship, although I think Clairmont would have wanted one, but he was not interested in Clairmont as a relationship material type person. And he went on to have more affairs with married women in Venice. One in particular, Countess Guiccioli, was very widely known because he moved in with her and they had loud public fights. Everyone reported on their public fights that they would have in the street and loudly in her home. And she would kick him out and made him sleep in the gondola outside, which is kind of like making someone go sleep in the car after having a big fight. And when he left Italy and went to Greece, and she threw herself into a canal over him. She did survive, but she tried to pull an Ophelia. It just didn't work. They fished her out before she died of it. But that's her there with her very Christina Ricci looking for it. It must be an Italian thing. Anyway, that's Clairmont, by the way, and if I didn't say that before. Okay, but while he was in Italy, he did a whole lot of writing. He wrote the 4th Childe Harold canto. He wrote a supernatural poem called Manfred. He wrote a closet drama called Cain, which is not what you think it means. A closet drama is a play that's never meant to be performed. It's meant to be read on the page, even though it is a play. And he wrote a satirical poem called Beppo, which is humorous. It was kind of like the story of The Princess Bride, if it's a movie you've ever seen. And the message of that poem is, unsurprisingly, that adultery shouldn't be a big deal. I mean, what's the big deal, man? Byron was doing that hippie romantic thing, free love, living on the commune, do whatever you want, whenever you want, with whomever you want. That attitude permeates a lot of his work. But then after Beppo, he went on to exclusively work on what's widely regarded to be his masterpiece, Don Juan. That's right, I just said Don Juan. Now, I know a lot of you, particularly those of you who speak Spanish as a first language, are writhing uncomfortably in your seats and saying, it's Don Juan, it's Don Juan. Well, yes, the original legend is about Don Juan, but the English poem is called Don Juan because the English back then, and even now, often decide just to not pronounce things as they're pronounced elsewhere. Just like for the French, for the English, it's not a filet chicken breast, it's a fillet, a chicken fillet, not a chicken fillet, because they just don't say it the way that the French would. In Byron's poem, he's going to reference the French wine claret, but he calls it claret, as the English do, and they say Don Juan. They don't say Don Juan in England, particularly at that time. So when I am talking about the Spanish legend Don Juan, that's what I will say. When I'm talking about Byron's poem, I will say Don Juan when we study this poem later. Anyway, it's an epic satire. It's wonderful. We'll read a chunk of it that's in your textbook. And it was so long that it wasn't even done when he died. It's fantastic. It's my favorite. You'll love it. Can't wait. Anyway, in addition to being, the famous lover Byron, he was also famous as the revolutionary Byron. Much like the other romantics, he had all that social idealism that he could not put down. And yes, he was also disillusioned and angry about the way that the whole French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars went down. But he always could find new causes to get behind to encourage social progress in the world. And he did have a seat in the House of Lords because, he was a lord, Lord Byron. But he only appeared in Parliament and only spoke there 3 times, and only for specific reasons when he was deliberately ornery about specific things that made him very angry. His most famous appearance in Parliament was to defend the Luddites. Perhaps you've heard the term Luddites or Neo-Luddites. Luddites are people who were opposed to technology. You may recall me talking about how much the invention of the guillotine in France put people on edge, this machine that killed people. And the idea of the rise of machines and the Industrial Revolution was so upsetting to romantics. And so these Luddites were basically a group of anti-technology people who busted into factories with hammers and busted up factory machinery that were replacing jobs. And he was all about the Luddites and supported them, and went to Parliament to try to keep the Luddites from being executed after they destroyed a number of factories. And I don't think he was successful. I think the Luddites were still pretty harshly punished. But that was his most passionate speech in Parliament, was defending them. He also really hated Robert Southey, who had turned conservative. And so he perceived him as a lesser romantic poet, and he attacked him satirically. We'll see that in Don Juan. But Southey was part of the older generation of romantic poets with Coleridge and Wordsworth, and they were far more conservative than the younger generation, than Leigh Hunt or Edward Trelawney or Shelley or Byron or Keats or any of the rest of them. And so when he perceived Southey as a conservative, he had to go after him because he was a revolutionary progressive. And his politics eventually led him to Greece, and this is him in traditional Greek clothing. He was not Greek, but you could tell he really wished that he had been. And he was heavily involved in the independence movement from the Ottoman Empire that was occupying Greece at the time. And he came down to Greece with his money, and he pretended to have a lot of military expertise, even though he did not have any at all. And they let him lead a military group, and he decided that he was going to attack a Turkish fortress, and he didn't have any idea what he was doing. It might have been horrible, a total bloodbath if he'd ever made it to the fortress, but unfortunately he did not, because while they were setting up camp before they went into battle, he got some kind of fever. And we're not sure exactly what that fever was, but the doctor in the battlefield decided to do a bloodletting for him, which was outdated medicine at that time too as well. But he died of the bloodletting. He bled to death in what was supposed to be a treatment for a fever, and he died at the age of 36 in 1824. And this is a painting that is a memorial painting of Byron. And you can see here that these are his laurels down here, listing his accomplishments. His lute there is supposed to represent that he was a poet and a minstrel. And he's got the olive leaf laurel around his head, that he was a statesman. And the The sword means that he was a warrior and all of that. And then this lamp is the light of knowledge, and all of this is symbolic. But of course, notice that even though you have this handsome corpse, and there's suspiciously no blood here, so obviously this is not an accurate portrait of his death, you have the sheet over his one club foot. So you can't see what was wrong with the foot. And he was a hero to the Greek people. There are many statues of Byron in Greece. There's even a suburb of Athens named after Byron. I can't pronounce it, but if you look on the map, you can see it. He loved Greece, and Greece loved him. So that's how he died, young, just like Shelley. Although Shelley died at 29 and Byron died at 36. So he got 7 years more than Shelley did, which is just not enough. And all these characters that you see on this screen here, I think, have been impacted in one way or another by Byron and the traits of the Byronic hero. You have Johnny Depp as both the persona of that celebrity, that person, Johnny Depp, and of course the Captain Jack Sparrow definitely feeds into the Byronic hero. You have Don Draper from Mad Men, if any of you watched that. You have James Bond, for sure, is modeled on Byron. You have James Dean, the original rebel without a cause. You have George Clooney, not a character that he's played, but George Clooney himself is somewhat of a Byronic hero. You have Wolverine here, you have Batman. A lot of the superheroes, the darker superheroes, are definitely Byronic heroes. Of course, the vampire archetype definitely was inspired by Byron. And you have Jay-Z here, whose dark bad boy past also makes him, irresistible to even Beyonce. So, traits that the Byronic hero might have. First, the Byronic hero is going to be arrogant, just like all the guys on that page were. Cunning and crafty. They're going to be always working the angles to get what they want. They're going to be cynical, looking down on the world, pretty much, not ever really seeing an optimistic end to anything. They're going to be disrespectful of your rank and privilege. They're not going to be impressed that your father is, a sergeant major in the army. They don't care about that. And most importantly, they're going to be emotionally conflicted / bipolar / moody. That's a key component of the Byronic hero. He's got to be difficult. You're not going to have a grinning, happy, upbeat Byronic hero, at least not all the time. He's also going to have dark moods that you can't explain. He's going to hate social institutions and norms. He's going to hate high school. He's going to hate, the idea of marriage. He's going to hate this idea that he's supposed to go get a job and work for 30 years and, drive a sedan. He's not going to be into that. He has to have a troubled past or be suffering from an unnamed crime. Something happened in the past, but you don't know exactly what it is. Or maybe he'd been in trouble, or maybe he's on the run from the law, but you just can't really know for sure. And he has to be intelligent and perceptive. Byronic hero is not going to be a himbo. He's going to know what's going on in the world. He's going to be able to figure you out in a second and be really, really smart. But he's also going to be world weary. He's not going to be naive. He's going to have seen everything and done everything. You're not going to be able to surprise him at all. He's going to be mysterious, magnetic, charismatic. Everybody's going to be drawn to him, and they're going to wonder, what's he about? And of course, he's going to be seductive and sexually attractive. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he is physically attractive. I know a lot of you are probably rolling your eyes when I put up Jay-Z and Captain Jack Sparrow. They're not, you don't really look at them and think male model material, but a Byronic hero at the top of his game does not have to be traditionally physically attractive. They just have to be, seductively and sexually attractive. But at the same time, and this is an interesting balance that a Byronic hero can strike. They're going to be arrogant, but they're also going to be self-critical and introspective. They're going to be capable of criticizing themselves while at the same time being arrogant. Artists are really good at pulling this off. But it's, for example, why Kanye West is not a Byronic hero. Kanye West is not self-critical. And if he's introspective, he doesn't talk about it. And a Byronic hero is also going to be self-destructive. He's going to do things to undermine his success. He's going to have a drinking problem or a drug problem, or he's going to drive too fast, or he's going to get himself fired all the time from jobs at which he could be really good, or he's going to tear apart relationships with people who love him because he just can't let himself, thrive and be happy. He's going to be socially and sexually dominant. He's going to take control of every room into which he enters. He's going to be sophisticated and educated. Now, there are some exceptions of when the Byronic hero is just kind of street educated, but for the most part, a Byronic hero is going to know a lot. They may be self-educated, but they're definitely going to know a great deal about the world in which they live. And what's really important is that a Byronic hero is going to struggle with integrity. Now, note that I don't say that he's going to be amoral or unethical. That is not the case. But a Byronic hero is going to struggle to make the right decision. Ultimately, the Byronic hero is capable of making the right decision. If they weren't, they wouldn't be a hero character. They would be a villain. They would be the anti-hero. But a Byronic hero is gonna eventually do the right thing, but they're going to struggle with doing it. They're going to want to do the wrong thing. And occasionally they might even do the wrong thing, but then they'll pay for the wrong thing that they did and do better the next time. But they will be treated like an outcast or an outlaw because of, those struggles they've had and maybe the bad decisions they've made in the past, even though they've changed. Now, I'm sure that if you think about it, you can come up with a list of plenty of other characters in movies, books, or television who are like this, and we will discuss this in detail when I get back to class, and I see you later. So that's all I have to say about Byron today, and I hope that you are excited and prepped for our study of his poetry in the coming week. Thanks, guys.